Captain Riley Knox stepped off the transport shuttle and into the most pretentious building she'd ever seen, which was saying something considering she'd once been to a military gala where generals wore more medals than a Christmas tree as ornaments. The Galactic Council Chamber looked like someone had asked a committee of art students to design a monument to their own importance, then given them unlimited budgets and questionable taste. Floating crystals hummed with importance. Holographic displays showed absolutely nothing useful but looked very expensive doing it. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, were aliens who clearly thought they were hot stuff. Riley checked her credentials one more time. Captain Riley Knox, official representative of Earth and the Terran Federation. The paperwork was solid, the signatures were legitimate, and her security clearance was higher than most people's credit scores. Should be smooth sailing, right? Wrong. The first sign of trouble came when she reached the reception desk, which was being operated by what looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a filing cabinet. The creature's compound eyes swept over her with all the enthusiasm of a tax auditor finding a suspicious deduction. Name? It clicked. Captain Riley Knox, representing Earth. The clicking stopped. Several other aliens in the vicinity turned to stare, and Riley could practically hear the sound of cosmic eyebrows raising. The receptionist's mandibles twitched in what she was pretty sure was the alien equivalent of a smirk. Ah yes, the humans. How quaint. I'm afraid there seems to be some confusion about your attendance today. Riley's smile didn't waver, but her eyes got that particular glint that her subordinates back on Earth had learned to associate with someone about to have a very bad day. What kind of confusion? Well, you see, this is a meeting for established galactic civilizations, species with real contributions to interstellar society. Not for, it paused dramatically, recent arrivals to the cosmic community. Around them, other aliens were gathering like spectators at a car wreck. Riley recognized a few species from her briefing materials. There was a Zentorian, looking like a blue gorilla wearing a tuxedo. A couple of Vexians who resembled nothing so much as angry houseplants with teeth. And leading the pack was Ambassador Thorvak the Magnificent, a draconian who stood 8 feet tall and wore enough ceremonial sashes to outfit a Boy Scout convention. Recent arrivals, Riley repeated slowly. You mean the species that went from discovering fire to interstellar travel in less than 10,000 years? That recent? Thorvak stepped forward, his scaled chest puffed out like a rooster who'd been taking performance enhancement drugs. My dear primitive creature, the Draconian Empire has been navigating the stars since before your species learned to walk upright. Some of us have been civilized for millennia. Riley nodded thoughtfully. And in all those millennia, how many planets have you colonized? 17 proud worlds, Thorvak declared. Neat. We hit 23 last Tuesday. She turned back to the receptionist. Now about my seat. The insectoid alien's mandibles clicked rapidly. Ah, yes, well, there seems to have been a small oversight. We weren't expecting, that is to say, your chair appears to have been temporarily relocated. Riley looked around the chamber. Every other species had elaborate seating arrangements that looked like they'd been designed by someone with too much money and not enough taste. Her assigned spot had a view of a very nice potted plant. Temporarily relocated. Right. She pulled out her phone and checked the time. Well, that's fine. I'll just stand. This shouldn't take long. The Galactic Council Chamber filled up like a theater before a particularly juicy scandal was about to unfold. Riley found herself a nice spot against the wall where she could watch the show, which was clearly going to be all about her. Chancellor Vex Thul, a creature that looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a Supreme Court justice, that called the session to order with a series of melodious chimes that probably sounded very dignified if you were into that sort of thing. Esteemed colleagues, Vex Thul's voice resonated with the kind of authority that came from never having been questioned. We gather today to address a rather unprecedented situation. The species known as humans has requested full membership in our council. A ripple of what Riley assumed was laughter passed through the assembled aliens. It sounded like a combination of whale songs and dental drills. Ambassador Thorvak rose to his considerable height, his ceremonial sashes catching the light like a disco ball, having an identity crisis. Honored Chancellor, surely this is some form of cosmic jest. Humans? Full membership? They've been in space for what? A few decades? My morning grooming routine has longer historical precedent. The Centaurian delegate, who Riley's briefing materials identified as General Blocks, stood up with all the grace of a blue refrigerator learning to walk. The Centaurian Republic has observed these humans for some time. They are primitive, violent, and obsessed with something they call caffeine. Hardly the qualities we seek in civilized discourse. Oh, but it gets worse, chimed in Ambassador Krex of the Vexian Collective, her plant-like fronds rustling with what Riley was pretty sure was smugness. They still engage in something called war among their own species. Can you imagine? Fighting among themselves when they could be fighting someone else entirely. It's almost inefficient. Riley checked her watch again and stifled a yawn. This was going about as well as she'd expected. The Altarian representative, a being that looked like a cross between a swan and a philosophy professor, glided forward. Furthermore, their cultural development is frankly embarrassing. They still watch something called reality television. And don't get me started on their music. I heard something called death metal, and I'm still in therapy. The humans also have this bizarre concept called personal space, added the Kelvian delegate, who was essentially a walking crystal formation with delusions of grandeur. They actually prefer not to share consciousness during casual conversation. How do they even govern themselves without constant mental linkage? Thorvak was really getting into it now, pacing back and forth like a prosecutor going for the death penalty. And let's discuss their so-called diplomacy. They sent us a single representative. He gestured dramatically at Riley, one individual to speak for an entire species. The Draconian Empire sends a minimum delegation of 47 ambassadors for a simple trade discussion. Riley cleared her throat politely. Actually, I asked them to let me come alone. The chamber fell silent. Every alien eye, compound eye, optical sensor, and whatever the Altarians had instead of eyes focused on her. You asked to come alone? Thorvak's voice cracked slightly. Yep, figured this would go faster with just me. Less paperwork, you know. Plus, honestly, my colleagues have this annoying habit of being diplomatic. I thought we might get better results with a more direct approach. The silence stretched longer. Riley could practically hear the gears turning in whatever these aliens used for brains. Chancellor Vexthal's chimes sounded distinctly nervous. And you feel qualified to represent your entire species by yourself? Riley shrugged. Well, I did read the briefing packet on the flight over. Plus, I've got a pretty good handle on human nature. We're not that complicated, really. She glanced around the room. Unlike some species I could mention. The Cosmic Peanut Gallery was having entirely too much fun at humanity's expense, and Riley was starting to get that familiar feeling she'd had right before she'd decided to become a soldier instead of a diplomat. It was the same feeling she'd gotten in high school when the popular kids thought they were being clever. She pushed herself off the wall and walked to the center of the chamber. Every conversation stopped like someone had hit a universal mute button. You know, she said conversationally, you folks seem to have some interesting opinions about human violence. Tell me, Ambassador Thorvak, what's the largest military conflict in Draconian history? Thorvak's chest puffed out with pride. The Great Expansion Wars, naturally. 7 glorious years of conquest that brought 17 systems under Draconian rule. Over 400,000 casualties across multiple worlds. 400,000. 7 years. Riley nodded like she was impressed. And General Blocks, what about the Centaurian Republic? General Blocks's blue features hardened with military bearing. The unification campaign. 12 years of strategic warfare that united our entire sector under Centaurian leadership. Nearly 600,000 casualties. But it established peace for over 2 centuries. 600,000, 12 years. Very impressive. Riley turned to the plant like Vexian. Ambassador Krex? The collective wars, Krex replied, her fronds rustling with remembered glory. 15 years of necessary conflict to establish the natural order. 850,000 casualties. But it created the foundation of modern Vexian civilization. Riley walked slowly around the chamber as she spoke, her voice carrying the kind of casual authority that made seasoned officers sit up straight without knowing why. So let me get this straight. Your most devastating conflicts, the ones that define your civilizations, involved hundreds of thousands of casualties over years or decades. She stopped and smiled. That's adorable. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. You see, we had this little disagreement on Earth. We called it World War I. Ran from 1914 to 1918. 4 years. When it was over, we'd managed to rack up somewhere between 15 and 22 million casualties, depending on how you count. The silence was no longer polite. It was the kind of silence that preceded either applause or evacuation orders. But here's the thing, Riley continued, her smile never wavering. We looked at those numbers and thought, you know what? We can do better. So 20 years later, we had a rematch. World War II. 6 years that time. We managed to bump our numbers up to somewhere between 70 and 85 million casualties. General Blox's blue coloring had shifted to something closer to gray. 70 million? Oh, that's just the human casualties. See, we'd figured out how to involve pretty much our entire species by that point. We had civilians building weapons, children collecting scrap metal, grandmothers running intelligence networks. Total war, we called it. Catchy name, right? Ambassador Krex's fronds had stopped rustling entirely. Your entire species participated in warfare? Well, not everyone was shooting people, if that's what you mean. Some of us were too busy building the machines that shot people more efficiently. Did you know that at the height of World War II, the United States was producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes? 1 ship every day? We retooled our entire industrial base for warfare in less than a year. Riley paused to check her watch again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. See, those were just our modern wars. We've been doing this for a while. The assembled aliens looked like they were beginning to question their life choices, but Riley was just getting warmed up. She had that look in her eyes that her drill sergeant used to get right before making recruits do push-ups until they questioned the nature of existence. Let me put this in perspective for you, she said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be notes. You mentioned that humans have been in space for a few decades. That's true. We've been building starships for about 50 years. But we've been building war machines for considerably longer. She looked up from her phone with the expression of someone about to deliver very bad news. Take the Battle of Stalingrad. 1 city, 1 battle. It lasted about 5 months and cost roughly 2 million casualties. That's more than your 3 greatest military conflicts combined. And it wasn't even our biggest battle. It was just Tuesday in 1942. Chancellor Vexthal's melodious chimes had taken on a distinctly nervous quality. Surely you're exaggerating for effect. Oh, I wish I was. See, the thing about humans is that we treat warfare like other species treat engineering problems. We iterate. We improve. We innovate. Riley's smile had taken on a quality that made several aliens unconsciously back away. By the end of World War II, we were producing so many weapons that we had to invent entirely new logistics systems just to keep track of them all. She started pacing again, her voice taking on the rhythm of a lecture that no one wanted to hear but couldn't stop listening to. The United States built nearly 300,000 aircraft during World War II. The Soviet Union produced over 100,000 tanks. Germany manufactured 67,000 aircraft. And that's just 3 countries, out of dozens involved in the conflict. General Blox made a sound that might have been a whimper. Your entire planet was at war? Pretty much, yeah. We even dragged in countries that didn't want to fight. Australia got involved because Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, which was American. The Americans got involved because the Germans declared war on them. The Germans were fighting the Russians, who were also fighting the Japanese, who were fighting the Chinese, who were fighting each other when they weren't fighting the Japanese. Riley paused to let that sink in. The chamber was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop if pins made noise in vacuum. But here's my favorite part, she continued. While all this was going on, we were also inventing new ways to kill each other. Radar, sonar, jet engines, rocket technology, computer systems for calculating artillery trajectories, and oh, this little thing called nuclear weapons. The word nuclear seemed to have a magical effect on the assembled aliens. Several of them made sounds that their translators couldn't quite handle, resulting in a cacophony of electronic squeaks and static. We built 2 of them, dropped them on cities, and immediately started building more because we figured we might need them later. The blast at Hiroshima was equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional explosives. We built it in 3 years while also fighting a global war on multiple fronts. Ambassador Thorvak's sashes were no longer catching the light in quite the same way. They seemed to have wilted. You developed planet-killing weapons while engaged in total warfare? Planet-killing? Oh, these weren't planet killers. These were city killers. The planet killers came later, during what we called the Cold War. But that's a whole different story involving enough nuclear weapons to sterilize our entire planet several times over. And spy networks that made paranoia a form of art. Riley checked her phone again. But I should probably mention that all of this, everything I've told you about, represents maybe the last century of human warfare. We've been doing this for considerably longer. Something changed in the chamber. The air seemed to grow thicker, and the elaborate lighting systems dimmed without anyone touching the controls. Riley stood in the center of the room, but somehow she seemed larger, as if she was casting a shadow that belonged to someone much bigger. "See, the thing about humans," she said, and her voice carried undertones that hadn't been there before, "is that we don't just represent ourselves. Every human who stands before you carries the weight of everyone who came before." The temperature continued to drop. Several aliens were now openly looking around for the exits. "I'm not just Captain Riley Knox, representing modern humanity. I'm speaking for 72,000 years of human dead. Every warrior who ever picked up a club, a sword, a rifle, or a starship weapon. Every soldier who ever stood on a battlefield and decided that something was worth dying for." Her eyes seemed to reflect light that wasn't coming from anywhere in the chamber. "You want to know about human violence? Let me tell you about the Mongol Empire. 13 million square miles conquered in about a century. They killed so many people that you can see the reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide in ice core samples. That's right. They depopulated entire regions so thoroughly that forests grew back and changed the planet's atmosphere. The holographic displays around the chamber began showing images, though no one had activated them. Images of battles, warriors, weapons spanning millennia. Or maybe you'd prefer to hear about the Roman Empire. They turned warfare into such an efficient system that they built roads to make it easier to move armies around. They crucified rebels by the thousands along those roads as decoration. They had gladiatorial games where people fought to the death for entertainment. Riley raised her hand and the images changed, showing massive armies, siege engines, naval battles. The Vikings raided across 3 continents and discovered America 500 years before anyone else admitted it existed. The Japanese samurai turned dying in battle into an art form. The Spartans trained their children to be soldiers from birth and built a society where dying in retreat was, literally, illegal. General Blocks was trying very hard to become one with his chair. How many of you were there? Riley smiled, and for a moment her face seemed to flicker, as if other faces were overlapping with hers. Young faces, old faces, scarred faces, faces that had seen too much and decided to keep going anyway. Current estimates put the total number of humans who have ever lived at around 115 billion. Most of them died young, violent deaths, war, famine, disease, accident. But they all left children who survived to fight another day. The chamber was now filled with shadows that moved independently of their owners, whispers in languages that the universal translators couldn't process. The sound of marching feet, clashing weapons, war cries across the centuries. Every human carries that legacy. We're not just individuals, we're the descendants of survivors. 72,000 years of humans who looked at impossible odds and said, "Hold my beer and watch this." Chancellor Vexthal's chimes were now barely audible. "What do you want from us?" Riley's expression softened, but the shadows didn't fade. If anything, they seemed to press closer to the assembled aliens. The same thing humans have always wanted: respect, recognition, A seat at the table. She paused. And maybe a little healthy fear wouldn't go amiss. Ambassador Thorvak had somehow managed to shrink down to about half his original size. And if we refuse? Riley shrugged, and the gesture somehow carried the weight of every human who had ever shrugged off impossible odds. Then I guess you'll find out what happens when you piss off a species that considers total extinction events to be character-building exercises. The vote was unanimous. And fast. Suspiciously fast, actually, like someone had lit a fire under the usually ponderous galactic bureaucracy. Riley found herself in possession of not just full council membership, but also a comprehensive benefits package that included diplomatic immunity, preferential trade status, and what appeared to be a complimentary fruit basket. The shadows faded, the temperature returned to normal, and the various alien delegates suddenly remembered they had very important meetings to attend elsewhere. Except they were all too polite or too terrified to actually leave before the session was officially concluded. Chancellor Vexthal's chimes had regained some of their former authority, though they still carried an undertone of someone who had recently seen their mortality flash before their eyes. The motion carries. Humanity is hereby granted full membership in the Galactic Council, with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities therein. Riley nodded graciously. Thank you. I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Indeed, said Ambassador Thorvak, who had somehow managed to reinflate to his original size but still looked like he was expecting bad news. I'm sure humanity will bring many valuable perspectives to our discussions. Oh, absolutely. We're very collaborative. Riley pulled out her phone and made a note. In fact, we've already identified several areas where we think we can make meaningful contributions. The assembled aliens exchanged glances that roughly translated to "oh shit" in several languages. General Blocks cleared his throat nervously. What sort of contributions? Well, for starters, we noticed that galactic commerce is pretty inefficient. Multiple currencies, complex trade agreements, lots of bureaucratic overhead. We've been working on some streamlining proposals. Ambassador Krex's fronds rustled with what was definitely anxiety now. Streamlining? Simplified trade protocols, standardized currency exchange, reduced regulatory barriers. You know, basic efficiency improvements. We've had great success with similar programs on Earth. We call it economic integration. Riley scrolled through her phone with the casual air of someone reading a grocery list. We're also very interested in your conflict resolution mechanisms. It seems like a lot of galactic disputes drag on for years or even decades. We have some innovative approaches to bringing negotiations to rapid, decisive conclusions. The silence was profound and deeply uncomfortable. And of course, Riley continued cheerfully, we're excited to share our expertise in space exploration. We've been expanding pretty aggressively since we got our FTL drives working. 23 colonies in the last few months. And we're scouting dozens more systems. It's amazing how much Lebensraum you can find when you're not picky about existing inhabitants. Chancellor Vexthal's chimes cracked slightly. Existing inhabitants? Oh, don't worry. We're always very diplomatic about it. We prefer negotiated settlements. Most species are surprisingly reasonable once you explain the alternatives properly. Riley smiled that same unsettling smile. We've found that our reputation precedes us these days, which really speeds up the whole process. Ambassador Thorvak was now openly calculating escape routes. And if they're not reasonable? Riley shrugged. Well, humans are very adaptable. We've never met a problem we couldn't solve with sufficient application of creativity and industrial capacity. Plus, we've got about 12 billion people back on Earth who are getting a little antsy about expansion opportunities. She checked her watch one final time. Speaking of which, I should probably get back. We've got a colony ship launching next week, and I promised I'd be there for the christening. It's going to be our biggest one yet. We're calling it the Enterprise. Riley headed for the exit, pausing at the door to look back at the assembled aliens with the expression of someone who had just concluded a very satisfactory business meeting. Thanks again for the warm welcome. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of each other in the future. Her smile widened. After all, the galaxy's a pretty small place when you really think about it. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving the council chamber in the kind of silence usually reserved for funeral homes and crime scenes. It was General Blocks who finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we may have made a terrible mistake." Chancellor Vex Thul's chimes sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. "No, my friend. I think we may have avoided one."